Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of Better Humans at Work. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Sai Islam, who's co-founder and vice president of consulting with Talent Metrics. Dr. Islam has over 15 years of experience providing data analytic, training, and organizational development support to organizations in a variety of workplace settings. He's consulted with Fortune 100 companies like IBM and teams like the Florida Panthers. Sai also served in leadership roles with ATD New York City and ATD Long Island, and his book Leaders Assemble: Leadership Lessons from the Marvel Cinematic Universe was published by Emerald Publishing. Sai, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Really excited to be here and love having casual chats about HR and AI and whatever else comes up.
I love it. I love it. And the topic today we're going to talk about is employee voice and how we can use employee voice methodologies and listening processes to improve the human experience at work. Before we get into that, though, Sai, would you mind sharing with our audience a little bit about your background and the work that you do?
Sure. So I wear a couple of different hats. Many years ago, I graduated from Rutgers University with a degree in economics. When I started college, I thought that I was going to be a South Asian stereotype. I thought I was going to go be a medical doctor. My brother's a plastic surgeon. I've got a lot of doctors in the family. And I did this internship at a hospital and I hated it. It wasn't anything like ER. That show was a lie. I was not, saving lives. It was not satisfying for me in any way. And up to that point, I had built like my whole identity around being, a future doctor. And so I had no clue what I was going to do. And I had this econ minor that I flipped into a econ major, and I ended up graduating with that degree. And then I ended up getting a job and kind of working in a hybrid talent acquisition training role, and I really liked it. And I couldn't, I was like, oh, this is really interesting to me. I decided to pursue an MBA in HR a couple of years into the job, and as I was going through the MBA coursework, I discovered industrial organizational psychology. Dr. Marcus Crede, who's kind of well known in the IO circles, was one of my professors, and he really got me interested in looking at human resources through a more rigorous kind of scientific lens.
Mm-hmm.
And then I decided it would be a great idea to pursue a PhD. In addition to an MBA and in addition to a master's in industrial organizational psych, which I don't recommend for anybody else. Like, just get one master's and then go. But I thought, oh, this is great. Let me just get really overeducated. I ended up going to do my PhD at Hofstra University and did my degree in applied organizational psychology. And I had in mind for my career that I wanted to do two things. I really love teaching. I love education. So I'm an associate professor at Farmingdale State College right now. And then in addition to that, I do consulting through Talent Metrics Consulting. I'm the vice president of consulting there. And, that was part of the plan, that I wanted to split my time between the world of academia, the world of science, and then the world of work. And I thought that that was a great balance because having been a part of a lot of conversations in management and now working with leaders, in a variety of different ways within organizations as an external consultant, when you see decision making and how decisions get made in organizations, having a little bit more scientific rigor can be really, really helpful. And so that's always informed everything that I do in terms of my practice. We want to be able to show a clear through line between the decisions that organizations are making and the data around which they're making those decisions. And I think we'll have a fun time talking about how employee voice kind of fits into that conversation.
What I love that you highlighted was the distinction between HR and IO psychology and really bringing in the scientific rigor. That's how I like to talk about it as well. Whereas, HR really is in the day to day and compliance and regulatory. And HR I see is becoming a more strategic role in organizations, especially with HR VPs, HR business partners. But when I delineate IO from HR, I always talk about the science piece. And it really is, applying the theory and the science and the practice. And that's what we're trying to do with Inclusalytics, is bring more scientific rigor to the DEI space. And so I love that delineation. How is it juggling the academic and the applied? I tried my own hand at teaching at a local university. It was actually an HR course, and I just found it to be too much. I had to take a step back, unfortunately, and just focus on the business. So how do you juggle both?
Poorly. That's how. Well, there's two things that you need if you want to juggle something like that. Number one, you need good teams on both sides. So my academic department is very supportive, very helpful, and my team in talent metrics is very supportive and very helpful. And I can't really balance those things without a supportive team on both sides. And then at home, you also need a very supportive team member. My wife is very understanding. My toddler son doesn't really understand much, but he's been very accepting of like, Daddy has to be on this meeting. You can watch Blippi for the next 15 minutes. So that's been very, very helpful. Like that's really the key. You need to have both of those things. And then I had some models for for this combined sort of academic practitioner type role. All my favorite professors were also consultants, and they had fairly thriving consulting practices for being full-time academics. And so it's a model that I kind of learned from them, because I don't think I would enjoy just being a consultant all the time. I really enjoy teaching, and I know that I can actually have a huge impact on what many many of my students, many organizations are going through by teaching students and then showing them how to use their knowledge of science to kind of improve their organizations.
Yeah. And just having that lived experience, I think it's wild how many business school professors have never set foot in an organization as an employee and as a leader. And I remember I taught management back at Colorado State, and a student asked one day, like, what is it like to fire someone? And I didn't have any answer because at that point, I had never fired anyone. Now I have plenty of stories to share nowadays, but having that experience to bring break back into the classroom, I'm sure the students get a lot of value from that.
Yeah.
So if you wouldn't mind, Sai, kind of putting your teacher hat on and talking to the audience a little bit, what do we mean by employee voice in the context of IO and HR?
Okay. So when we talk about employee voice, what we're really talking about is giving the employees the opportunity to give feedback about where the organization is going and what the experience of being in this organization, what it's actually like. So many organizations, especially C-level employees, whether it's CMOs, CEOs, CFOs, everybody understands that the customer has a voice, and you would never ignore the voice of the customer.
Yeah.
Right. And if the organizations realize that, yes, I need to listen to these people because they're giving me money to continue this business. But what happens in many organizations is the employee voice is not heard as clearly, right? And so when we talk about employee voice, or another term that gets used is employee listening, what we're really saying is that you are communicating or getting information about the experience of work from your employees. And that can take a number of different forms. It could be focus groups. It could be, kind of an annual survey, or what's called a pulse survey, which is a shorter survey that's delivered more frequently. It could come in the form of other, performance management feedback forums, things like that. But that's what we're really talking about is, when we talk about employee voice, is really paying attention to what's happening to the employees through that listening process by giving them that voice. And in fact, if you look at what's happening in a lot of organizations now in terms of labor relations, one of the things you're seeing is that employees are expressing themselves in a variety of ways. Sometimes that looks like joining a union. Sometimes that means going on strike. Sometimes that means kind of pushing back and trying to get better benefits or taking time off or something along those lines. And the goal of the organization should be to create an environment where your employees can thrive and can do really well. And one of the ways in which we know that that's happening is by really listening to that employee voice.
What have been some good examples of how organizations have taken what they learned from that listening process and actually applied it in a way that makes life better at work for those employees?
Okay. So in our consulting experience, one of the things that we've seen is, in terms of like environmental factors that impact work. So in some of the, employee surveys that we've managed for organizations, some of the things that we found out had to do with, and I can't violate my NDA about
Of
this, so
course.
I'll keep this vague. We found out that there were some environmental impediments to the work that these employees were doing, right? That there were things that the organization could do to change the work environment and help the employees perform more effectively, right? And so when we talk about employee voice, or when we're talking about listening to the employees, one of the key things to remember, and this is an attitude that I've had to kind of unteach from many clients, is that it's not a waste of time to listen to the employees, because they're telling you about what the work actually looks like, right?
Hmm.
They're telling you what's happening in the workplace, what the experience is like, and you can take that information and then make the work more efficient. You can take that information and make the workplace more effective, make teams work more effectively just by paying attention to that. And so in this particular example, we were able to give this organization a sense that, this environment, this work environment, it needs to be improved. It needs to be better. Here's some things that you can do. And we gave them some recommendations about changes that you could make.
And when it comes to like methodologies, I know you explained
Mhm.
earlier there's focus groups, there's surveys,
Mhm.
there's pulse surveys, there's those more I hadn't thought about striking, and there's, here in Pittsburgh, our Post Gazette, our local newspaper, has been striking for months. And
Mhm.
having that
Mhm.
picket line itself be an opportunity for employee voice. But what
Mhm.
methodologies do you find really get at that employee voice piece? And I'm thinking about
Mhm.
trust. So, like our work with
Mhm.
DEI, building a lot of trust to help
Mhm.
employees know that they're going to, we're going to share their feedback, and we're going to do something
Mhm.
with what they provide. But what
Mhm.
what methodologies, if someone watching out there wanted to really start delving into employee voice, would you recommend to make sure that you're
Mhm.
actually hearing what's going on?
Mhm. So there are two places that I'd suggest that you start. Number one, and this also depends on your organization's capacity. I like going for, kind of quick victories
Mm,
and then build capacity from there. So many times when we talk about something like employee voice, and sometimes you see this also in other areas of practice, but especially in employee voice, um, organizations want to have these very big rollouts, these big, plans about, okay, we're gonna do a survey every quarter. We're gonna give feedback to everybody this many times, and sometimes I hear that and I'm like, guys, you've never done this before. We're only talking about trying to do like one thing. Let's focus on getting the one thing right and then communicating that out. So I always recommend starting small, and then in terms of methodology, I find that exit interviews and exit surveys are actually a very, very good place to start if you do them, for a couple of reasons. Number one, organizations, as a general rule, they don't want turnover. They don't want employees to just say, "Hey, peace out, I'm out of here," right? Um, and if you can get that type of information, one of the things we found in our practice is that getting that exit interview information, getting that type of feedback, is something that can really move the needle with C-level employees, because
mhm.
they can say, "Wow, this person, they're out,
Yeah.
they're leaving," and there is a perception that feedback is quote unquote more honest. I'm not 100% sure if that's actually the case, but that's the perception of it. Um, and then the second thing that I usually suggest is, if you can't do a full on survey, or if you don't have a survey ready to go, or if you feel like you can't implement something like that, doing a series of small focus groups can be really effective. And having those conversations and getting at that is really effective. And so the question there becomes, do you want to collect new data? Or if you already have existing data, can you utilize that and kind of identify areas of improvement?
What do you think are some good questions for focus groups? Or if you could only ask like one or two questions, what would those questions be?
Usually the types of questions that we ask are pretty broad, just to kick things off. So, for example, and I try not to personalize this. This is one of the things that happens occasionally in focus groups, because you've got a group of people together there, and sometimes, depending on who's in the room, how varied your sample happens to be. If it's all one team, one group, you might have different type of experience. But you may want to just start off by saying, what are some obstacles that you face in the workplace, right? I like that question quite a bit, because you're not personalizing it. You're not saying like, hey, what sucks about your work team or your boss, right? You're just saying, well, what are some things that we can do, to face some of the obstacles that you're facing? And that makes it more about the work. And what you find is that if you allow the focus group to function, that people will reveal what's really happening, in that process, in that conversation. Sometimes if you've built the room correctly with a good sample, sometimes they'll spur each other on with feedback.
Mm,
And it's great to get that feedback. The one thing I will caution everybody is, if you do get this feedback, you do have to action on it.
yeah.
You've got to draw a real connection between, hey, we did these focus groups, we did the survey, and based on this, we're making the following changes. And if that doesn't happen, that trust that you were talking about before, it's not going to be there. They're not going to respond as much. The employees are going to say, this is nonsense, nobody did anything, and that's a big issue.
You mentioned earlier about that exit interview data being a really good influencing factor when it comes to getting senior level buy-in. Have you found any other methods effective for just getting executives to care about employee voice, value it, especially to the extent they value that customer voice that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So one other way that we found is getting reviews from external websites.
Mm,
So things like Indeed, things like LinkedIn, kind of data mining, things like social media has been helpful, because you'll notice there's this parallel that we're making between customer experience, employee experience, marketing, HR. And part of the reason for that is, most C-level managers, CEOs, etc., they understand how the business works, and they understand that customer journey, that customer experience. And so if you can give them a parallel to that, that can really help you to really deliver on on that employee experience. Because then what happens is, you're saying, well, okay, here's what's happening online, here's your reputation as an organization online. And then all of a sudden, a CEO, a CMO, CHRO, they start to say, well, wait a minute, this is what people are saying about us outside. How are we going to attract people? How are we going to get people to respond? One thing that we do occasionally with clients is we actually assess their application processes to measure something called applicant reactions,
mm,
especially for organizations that are having trouble hiring in their particular space. Sometimes what we find is that the actual application process is not attractive. It's too difficult. There's too much happening. And so that is also kind of like a marketing pipeline, right? Well,
mhm.
if a customer can't get through your website, then they're not going to end up buying. And we don't really want that, right?
Have you used stay interviews? I know the value of exit interviews is really could be really
Mhm.
powerful, but stay interviews, like what's your take on those?
Stay interviews can be really useful. And I think it helps if you have some long-term employees that you can talk to about why they're there for a really long time. We've done something similar to that with like municipalities and government agencies, where people are staying for extended periods of time. With some organizations that we've worked with, they've had like high levels of turnover, within groups or teams or departments. And so doing a stay interview with somebody who's like been in the company 6 months to a year, it's a little hard for me to kind of justify that as like, okay, this person's staying. Usually you want somebody who's been there for a little bit longer, but I do think there's value to that. Um, but one thing I will say is, and you know this from doing a lot of reading, is negative information bias is real. And so exit interview data sometimes comes across a little bit more negative, which sometimes it helps C-level employees to say, oh, well, now we need to put some resources behind this initiative. But stay interviews are also really useful, and you can do sort of the same things that you do with exit interviews. You can do it by survey. You can actually meet with people and have a conversation with them and illustrate some of these ideas.
For those watching out there, Sai, who really want to make that connection between employee voice and impact, what are some tips you have for connecting those dots and using employee voice for change in the organization?
Sure. So, number one, a lot of times employee voice measures, and this goes along with employee engagement measures, the way that organizations use them is to kind of benchmark against other organizations within the same industry. And we don't usually recommend that. We want organizations to look at it more like a marathon where you're competing against yourself. You've got a great time, you're running your marathon a certain amount of time. Let's beat that number. And so that internal focus is, I think, more important in some cases than looking at it externally and saying, well, within our industry, we're 2 points higher or 3 points higher. I have a hard time like understanding what that actually means from a functional perspective. And it's hard to action on something like that.
Yeah.
So if you stay internal, you stay focused on here's the initiatives that we did, here are the things that we did over the past year, here's where our level of voice happens to be, here's how the employees are feeling, here's how their experiences are point. That I think is very clear. So like really keeping track of what initiatives you're going through, what programs you're doing, and what you're offering to your employees, and then drawing a connection to that to the survey results or to focus group results. And then also in your communication, so this is my second tip, in the communications, being really explicit about why you're doing the things that you're doing, right? So based on the employee survey results, here's what we're doing. And you can even share those survey results. I know sometimes companies and organizations feel a little uncomfortable about that, but at least kind of communicating with your employees and letting them know, like, these are the numbers that we got, here's the feedback that we got, here's something that we're building out of that. And then the third thing is to really pay attention to qualitative data or written comments if you can get it. At Talent Metrics, we really love written comments. We've done a number of qualitative, kind of just academic research studies, and in our practice, we really enjoy using qualitative data, just because it's really useful for us to understand what changes need to happen within the process of work. So those are the three things I would kind of suggest for everybody to kind of focus on and to try to do. And I want to highlight one thing that I think is really important in this is that sometimes HR professionals, because having worked in HR and done that kind of work, one thing that I remember is I always thought everybody knew what I was doing. I really thought everybody thought, like, look at me, I'm covered in sweat here, working so hard. You must know what I'm doing. But the reality is that they may not. And it's up to us as professionals to communicate how those decisions are made, where those initiatives come from. And if you communicate it clearly, the employees can then say, well, oh, okay, I did this thing here, I gave this feedback here, and then they did this thing here, and then that's what's happening. And so it becomes more of a process, and it's almost like a conversation with your partner where your partner says, here are the things that we need, and then you say, yes, let's do them, and then you go back and say, hey, we did them, how's everything going? And so it's a very basic idea, but it's something that we don't see very often in organizations, just because it's hard to do it at scale.
And like, actions speak louder than words, and I feel like sometimes the act of collecting the data feels like, okay, they did the things, but the real action lies in what comes next. So I love those 3-pointers. So focus internally, not externally. Focus on make sure you put emphasis on that qualitative data, and then communicating back out to employees what was learned, and most importantly, what's going to be done about it. And then once it happens as well, because you're right, a lot of the HR work, the people work in organizations feels like it happens behind closed doors, even though it's serving all those employees. And so being able to communicate that out is critical. Sai, I'm so grateful you spent some time talking to our audience today about employee voice. It is a big component for those who are diversity, equity, inclusion advocates out there. The true power lies in amplifying voices that typically aren't heard in organizations, but all voices matter. And I just really appreciate you sharing your expertise of getting those voices out there so organizations can make meaningful change.
Thank you very much for having me. I don't know if everybody can tell, I love talking about this stuff, and this was a lot of fun. Thank you.
If people wanted to reach out to you, especially your work with Talent Metrics, what's the best way of them getting a hold of you?
They can go to the Talent Metrics website, www.talentmetrics.io. They can find me on LinkedIn. I also spend way too much time on Twitter at Scientist-Islam. So feel free to find me any which way you can, and I'm happy to connect.
Awesome. Thank you for all you do to make life better at work.